My name is Alan Fogwell. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for PTAC. Welcome to this session this morning on fugitive methane emissions technology to monitor and fix leaks faster. We know that there's a significant concern about fugitive leaks in our oil and gas systems. And today we've got a couple of experts in the area to talk about the various aspects of how to monitor for those leaks and how to get to fixing them and improving the methane emissions at various sites. Our event brings together two industry leaders, EasyOps and Horizon Compliance, experts in the field of digitizing and prioritizing frontline workers' daily activities, and an all-inclusive environmental compliance for operations. With new regulations and an increase in inspection, our speakers will discuss current and future regulatory requirements, best practices for emissions reporting, and how technology can equip operators to be proactive in terms of monitoring, repair, and reporting. We're very pleased to have these two experts here to talk about their knowledge of the various aspects of monitoring and repair work. Today we have Hilary Young, who is the co-founder and managing partner at Horizon Compliance, and Jordan Sieb, Director of Revenue Operations at EasyOps Group. EasyOps is an organization that has helped Canadian producers digitize and prioritize frontline worker activities. In early 2022, they purchased the payload technology and drift technology solutions to create a field to point of sale solution, inclusive of trucking logistics optimization and integrating capabilities and allowing further machine intelligence to optimize workforce performance. Horizon Compliance, it was founded in October of 2021 by Cody Halloran and Hilary. Having worked closely together, they've developed a new organization to focus on the all-inclusive environmental compliance support that's needed as we move forward in terms of regulating methane emissions. So today's event will start with Hilary, and then we'll move into Jordan's part of the presentation. We're going to have questions at the end, and you can type in your questions in the comment box, and I'll be passing them on to Hilary and Jordan when we get to that section. So thank you again for joining us. And Hilary, if you'd like to begin.
Thanks, Alan. Today I'm going to get started on reviewing the methane reduction regulations in the federal, Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan jurisdictions. So I'll be focusing on the fugitive emissions requirements in these programs, specifically for the upstream oil and gas sector. So first, I'm going to get into what the regulatory drivers for these regulations are. And what it all kind of stems from. Then I'll move on to the current regulations. I'll reviewing all the four different programs and comparing and contrasting them so we understand what the differences are. And then I'll close off by going into what might be coming in the future, reviewing the proposed framework that was released from the federal government last November. So first off, what the federal regulatory drivers are. Next slide. So yes, it stems from the federal methane reduction regulations that were implemented because of, the fact that the oil and gas sector accounts for about 40% of Canada's methane emissions. So back in 2016, the federal government committed to a 40 to 45% oil and gas sector methane reduction below 2012 levels by 2025. And so these regulations were published under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. By 2020, the equivalency agreements between the three provinces have been finalized, And so the intent of the federal methane regs, I think it was never intended to actually be implemented directly into each province, just because, well, first off, there's probably not enough manpower to implement it in these provinces from the feds, but also because we have such a significant oil and gas industry here, it is better for each province to regulate it separately and cater the needs specific to that province. And then on the flip side, the provinces were not, they did not want any federal oversight as well. So because of that, the federal regs do allow an equivalency agreement to be made so that each province can cater and specify specific province-specific approaches while ensuring the equivalent environmental outcomes. So the programs don't need to be identical so long as the outcome is the same and it moves us towards meeting our target for 40 to 45% reduction. So the main federal regulation that we are comparing to is the regulations respecting reduction in the release of methane in certain VOCs in the upstream oil and gas sector. In Alberta, the equivalent program, they decided to add a chapter to Directive 60 to kind of list the methane reduction requirements. In BC, they made amendments to the existing drilling and production regulation. And in Saskatchewan, they kind of started from scratch. They released the new oil and gas emissions management regulation. They also released various directives in support of this, but what is most relevant to fugitives is the Directive PNG 36, venting and flaring requirements, but also fugitive emissions requirements. So moving into the current regulations, so the next few slides have a lot of information, as you can see. So I'm not going to kind of dig into all of the specifics here. I'm mostly just going to flag things that are interesting and allow us to kind of compare and contrast and understand the differences between the four regs. And really, most of the slides in this section are just for us to be able to use as a reference in the future. So starting off for which facilities require fugitive emission surveys. In the federal regs, any facility that produces or receives more than 60 decks in 12 months is required to have a survey. So there are some exceptions, one of them being a single wellhead with no other equipment. Those sites do not have to have inspections. That 60 deck threshold is very low, so it's pretty much going to applied to most facilities. In Alberta and BC, only certain specific facility subtypes are required to have surveys, and so they've been listed here. And so this aligns with the same facility subtype as listed in Petronex. Screenings for certain sites are allowed to be done instead of surveys. So screenings are, they don't require a camera, and they are can be used or screened using audio, visual, or olfactory methods. So in Alberta, you're allowed to use screenings for well sites. And then for BC, you're allowed to use screenings for any facility that's not listed in that above list there. And then in Saskatchewan, they are using the same 60 deck threshold as the federal government, but this only applies to gas facilities. So this is because oil facilities are regulated under the oil and gas emissions management regulation that I mentioned before. These oil facilities are subject to methane reduction requirements under OGMRs, but this program that doesn't actually have any doesn't have a fugitive emissions component. So that means that any gas facilities that are not regulated under OGMRs are actually going to be subject to PNG 36, where they specify the requirements for fugitive emission surveys. So any gas facilities that meet that 60 deck threshold, as listed below here, will be required to have surveys. And again, since that threshold is quite low, this will pretty much be every gas facility. The federal regulation requires a tri-annual survey, no matter what, for all facilities that meet that threshold. In Alberta and BC, there are tri-annual or annual surveys, depending on what the facility subtype is. And then for any site that is allowed to have a screening instead of a survey, that needs to be done annually. For Saskatchewan, all gas facilities that meet that threshold will require a semi-annual survey, which is 2 times a year. So the definition of a leak is pretty consistent between the jurisdictions. So anything above or equal to 500 ppm of hydrocarbon. Federally, they add if it is detectable by really any means, a camera or your eyes, ears, or nose. So even if it is less than 500 ppm, if you can detect it, it is a leak, and you need to follow the repair schedule. In BC, they have it only if it is detectable from a gas imaging camera, it will be considered a leak no matter what. Alberta doesn't actually quantify or doesn't actually define what a leak is, but they do say that anything under 10,000 ppm doesn't require repair, but it does still need to be quantified at each survey until it is repaired. So it would still be part of your leak management program, but just no repairs required. For all jurisdictions, repairs are required within 30 days. Federal, Alberta, and BC, they all have a different level or a different level of how you confirm a leak and when you need to confirm a leak, or confirm a repair for any leaks that you detected. In Saskatchewan, they don't have anything specific on how you confirm when you confirm if a repair has been done, but they do have a section in their form that gives you an optional section to add your confirmation method. So it's up to operators if they want to include that information or not. And so each of these jurisdictions or the provincial programs have some sort of reporting aspect where you show that you are compliant with the program and you are following your fugitive emissions program. So these annual reports are mostly summarizing leaks, summarizing the number of surveys per facility, number of screenings per facility, if repairs have been made. So all of that is tracked in an annual report. But on top of that, there is another component that some jurisdictions have for quantifying the actual emissions released in that calendar year, or between a certain time period. And because of that, we need to understand the philosophy of how long a leak has been leaking. So in Alberta, the annual methane report requires the volume released and the mass of methane released. So their philosophy for a leak is half the time between the previous survey and the repair date, or a full year if there has not been a previous survey date. So that gets reported in the annual methane report. In BC, specifically for methane reduction requirements, they don't have a need or a requirement to quantify the exact emissions in a year, but they do have their requirements under the BC Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, where we need to follow WCI standards. And in WCI, the philosophy is a leak has started leaking from the date of the last survey and then ends on the repair date. And then finally, in Saskatchewan, leaks are required to be reported in Petronex under the vent category. So because of this, they are setting the leak to start leaking at the day of detection and then ending at the repair date. So many different lines of thought and different philosophies between the different jurisdictions for how long a leak has been leaking. And then, so in the next couple of slides, I'm going to be just reviewing some of the reporting and record keeping requirements between the jurisdictions. You can see that the core requirements are pretty much the same between all four, facility ID, type of detection, survey date, technician date, data, all things like that. In Saskatchewan, they follow the federal requirements quite heavily, but they do have a couple of extras like tracking the H2S concentration of a leak for health and safety issues, and then also proving that a release that you have observed is actually not a leak. So proving that it is actually less than 500 ppm. So it is tagged as a non-leak emission. Next slide. Okay. And then in Alberta, some other extra stuff that they're requiring you to keep track of, things like are thief hatches closed, checking if pneumatics are venting over the limit, checking if combustors or any other sort of emissions control are operating adequately. And then also looking at a specific component, looking at the history of previous leaks and keeping a record and tracking all of that for that specific component. And then in British Columbia, they're also adding storage tank inventory, checking that and looking at the emissions control status if there is one, if there are natural gas pneumatics present, and if so, how many pressurized days in a year at that site, and then also if the leak contains H2S. So between the 4 jurisdictions, you can see that there are a lot of differences in what is required to be tracked. And because this is all related to how we maintain compliance in the program, like these are very important things to keep track of. Next slide. So just to summarize the life cycle, or the order of operations of a Fugitives program. So first, of course, you identify the leak in the survey or the screening, and then you quantify the emission rate. You repair the leak within 30 days. You verify the repair if required. Make sure you adhere to all of the required record keeping. Report everything and summarize everything into your annual report. By the time that's done, you're probably due for another survey at that point. So you're going to start the whole cycle again. So it's kind of a continuous thing, continuous maintenance program that you are following here. Each facility you have will have a different survey or a different screening schedule. Each leak that you find will have a different repair schedule. So again, a lot of data to keep track of. And so some other considerations are facility boundaries. So the fugitive emissions requirements are specifically for the physical site location, which can be comprised of multiple Petronex IDs. So if you have, what you need to do is you need to keep track of grouping your Petronex IDs to each physical location in a way that you don't accidentally kind of drop different Petronex IDs and they fall through the cracks. So it is difficult to be able to kind of align all of the IDs into one location if you're just kind of looking at your infrastructure report, looking at your operator report. So really this is where we need the feedback from different companies for them to group the IDs together and consider that one facility. And if you have multiple Petronex IDs in a physical location, even if they have different facility subtypes, the facility subtype that has the most stringent requirements, those requirements are applicable to all of those IDs because they are all in that same physical location. And then any reporting that you do is generally always to that Petronex ID. So yeah, grouping everything is very important. And then of course we have the required compliance reporting to prove that you have met your obligations and have managed your fugitive emissions program. Summarize the number of leaks, number of surveys, confirmation of repairs, all of that needs to be reported annually to the provinces. But outside of that, we also have emissions reporting. So only Alberta and Saskatchewan specifically have requirements under the methane reduction requirements to quantify the amount of fugitives released in a calendar year. And you need to report that in Alberta to the annual methane report, and in Saskatchewan to Petronex under the vent code. But outside of that, for general greenhouse gas reporting, that of course applies to all provinces. Only BC gives you guidance on how to quantify how long a leak has been leaking. So in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and in Environment Canada greenhouse gas reporting, there's no guidance. So it's up to operators or up to companies to decide how they want to quantify each leak. For me, I like to align with the province as much as possible. So for Alberta, greenhouse gas reporting, I'll align to the requirements in D60, and for Saskatchewan, I will align with the requirements in Petronex just to make sure that they are consistent. It just makes it easier. And then so the key takeaway here is that data management is paramount. We have multiple jurisdictions, multiple data needs, different reporting requirements. And the nature of these programs is that it's all contingent, or it all hinges specifically on your reports and your record keeping. You could be doing all of the surveys and meeting your obligations, but if you don't have good record keeping and you end up losing some data, then you might as well not have done it. So to maintain compliance and to make sure that you're kind of on side if there is an audit, we need to make sure that all of this is in line. And really, it will likely become more stringent and more onerous in the future, especially looking at the proposed changes, which brings me to my next section. Next slide. Yeah, which I will close off my presentation by just going through the proposed changes that were released last year. So last November, the Environment Canada released a proposed federal regulatory framework for reducing oil and gas methane emissions. We're looking at a new 2030 target now. Our previous target, like I mentioned before, was 40 to 45% below 2012 levels by 2025. But now our new target is at least 75% reduction. So apparently we were on track to meet the 2025 target, but because of various changes and promises between different countries, we are now looking at 75% reduction. So in order to meet this new target, the proposed amendments are looking to expand the scope of the existing regulations. And how this would be done is it needs to apply to more sources. We need to eliminate exclusions and basically require zero emissions as much as possible. How they are proposing to achieve this is to mostly increase the stringency of venting reduction requirements, also add some more requirements like flaring elimination, gas conservation, and combustion efficiency minimums. But what I'm going to focus on, of course, is just the fugitive emissions component. Next slide. Okay, so right now, the provinces obviously have an equivalency agreement, but this can be terminated with at least 3 months written notice. Once the draft regulations are released, which is supposed to be soon, at that time, provinces will be engaging stakeholders and be reviewing and figuring out proposals to adjust their current approach to still ensure the same equivalent environmental outcomes to meet that 75% reduction. I'm assuming it's going to be a phased-in approach with most things in effect, or like the new changes in effect by 2030, mostly because a lot of what has been proposed, mostly on the venting side, is not actually feasible at this point in time. So I think what the plan is from Environment Canada is that they're hoping that technology or different methodologies will be available in the coming years. So then we would have some time to kind of develop how we're going to comply by 2030. And another important thing to note is that the proposed framework is just that, it's a proposed framework. I've heard that the approach from Environment Canada was to throw a lot of stuff on the wall and just see what sticks. So not everything will be implemented. So we're still, frantically waiting for the draft regs to come out. But it does give us a good idea of what are the things that they are looking at and what might be coming down the pipe to the different provinces. And so before we really dive in here, I think it is important to also compare the proposed federal framework specifically to the current federal regulations, because the equivalency agreements have allowed the provinces to have different different requirements so long as they in the end meets the same reduction targets. It might not be quite fair to compare the federal proposed framework to each province. So instead, I'm just going to compare the two federal ones together so we have an understanding of what the step change would be and then apply that thought process to the provinces. So first off, the framework has monthly inspections required for all facilities. And they've also added that non-producing wells are no longer exempt and now are required to have annual inspections. So this is a big change from the triannual survey requirement. Given that the provinces, most of the facilities in each province are not subject to triannual they are subject to the annual surveys and screenings. I don't think that monthly inspections will be required for every single site, but there definitely will be an increase in the number of surveys required. So which brings us into data management issues, more leaks found, more repairs to kind of schedule here. I think we'll also likely see a shift in the industry. We'll need to focus on different technologies to be able to kind of have an additional volume of fugitive emission surveys at all the sites. Some companies might be looking at doing this internally as well. It might not be economical to hire third parties anymore. And then with that, there may be more stringent requirements for training now, because we will require more boots on the ground. We will require more fugitive emission technicians available to do this increased number of surveys. Right now, in all jurisdictions, the training and competency requirements are quite soft and quite general. So I am expecting that they might tighten that up as we have more people. More people will need to be available to do this type of surveys. And then, I guess the next proposed framework is the leak repair must be completed immediately, or extensions must be requested. Right now, any extension, there are no such thing as extension requests. Generally, you just need to log the reason why you are not repairing a leak within 30 days and show that it meets the requirements in each different jurisdiction. Things like, if you need to wait until a turnaround, health and safety issue, most of the time you can just log those into your records to have for proof of why you did not repair it within 30 days. What the federal framework seems to be implying is that you need to request extension, but actually wait for approval before your request is granted. So that is a big change for all the different provinces. And to be honest, I don't think that that is even feasible, especially to the scale that we have in the provinces. The feds don't have enough manpower. The provinces don't have enough manpower to just handle the sheer volume of requests that will likely come in, especially if we have more and more inspections required. So I'm hoping that clause will be modified, or maybe the language not as hard or specific. But it does seem that the leak repair window will definitely be decreased from 30 days to immediately, or at least something less than that. And that concludes my part of the presentation. So I'll transfer it over to Jordan to review some strategies on how to manage all of this data.
Yeah, thank you, Hillary. So we've heard all about the current and proposed regulations here, and there is some things coming down the pipeline, especially in those proposed, which will kind of drive the need for technology, as Hillary said, not only for innovations probably in the machinery and the technology in the field and the equipment, but also for software to come in and help identify and manage emissions, and potentially even allow you to be proactive about when this stuff is actually going to happen and preventing it from happening in the first place. So I'm going to start off quick with just like traditional, where most companies are at now. You see a couple of different ways of collecting information here. On the left, you got the guy with the hyperspectral camera, the optical gas imaging. That is coming in a little bit. I call it traditional because it's someone manually walking around with the camera. But I think there's only 12 or 15 of those in Canada right now, and they're like 300,000 US. So it's pretty prohibitive to get these things right now, but they are trickling in. But to Hillary's points from earlier, data management is a huge issue. A lot of people now that are, especially when they're not using a software solution that's built for this kind of thing, are doing it on paper, maybe Excel. It can be very cumbersome, very error prone, but generally very heavy on your frontline staff to be collecting and entering this data in a way that makes sense. And then in order to collect it and aggregate it to make any kind of paint a larger picture for yourself is quite difficult, or at least very time consuming. So, the legacy systems that a lot of companies have in place aren't as effective especially for the proposed regulations and how much the time crunch is going to get reduced, especially that leak repair that Hillary mentioned, that's going to be a big problem. So what are some ways we can get around that stuff? And I wanted to touch on this before I jump into the full solutioning of where software can take us. But just having the data in our system, this is a very simple analysis of where we find the most emissions on a well site coming from. Obviously, there's other things at facilities and pipelines and stuff, but we focused on wellheads and that kind of thing, or well site facilities right now. And this is the kind of stuff you get. Everyone knows that like tank and PSV venting was a thing, but it's actually not the biggest one, not even half as big as some of the bigger ones. Improperly threaded piping, improperly like pipes not fitting together right. That's actually where a lot of the fugitive emissions are coming from in our system. And this is just what's being currently tracked by either operators or third-party inspectors feeding data into a system such as EasyOps. But the first step is always digitizing that data. Once you have it in one platform, aggregated in one place across all your operations, communicable between the teams, different shifts, that kind of thing, so everyone's in the know, head office and field, you can start getting into things like being proactive. Building a proactive schedule for your inspections, building a proactive schedule for your maintenance. Even with a little bit of machine learning right now, you can say, well, generally this type of seal or this type of fitting typically starts emitting enough emissions to be registered within this time frame. So let's set up a cadence to inspect it. And once it gets to that emissions threshold that's below what would be required, let's set a task to maintain it, replace it in kind, whatever you have to do to mitigate that risk of it actually becoming an issue. And then as you're doing that, it's all auditable and it's all captured in one system. So you can roll it up to the government, roll it up to your stakeholders, whatever you have to do. And that leads into the instant reporting, right? As soon as it's entered into the system, and the system, in our case, EasyOps, works both offline or online. So it doesn't matter how remote your site is. This data is getting into the system. Obviously, in the case of offline, once they'll have to sync to the server to get that kind of stuff into your hands in the head office. But the idea is, you can roll up this reporting daily, hourly, whatever you want. Typically people do it monthly. But the great part is you're capturing all of it. It's in one place and you can pull it out for whatever jurisdiction you're required. As Hillary mentioned, there's quite a few different nuanced pieces that each jurisdiction wants. You can pull those out as long as you're tracking the information. And if you know who you're going to have to report to, you have the guidelines, you can build a report that you just automate and send out or review and send out as needed. And going from just this, where we could be current state, if you move past the traditional stuff that I mentioned earlier into some kind of software that tracks this stuff, you could get into a little bit of where we want to take it. Real-time emissions monitoring, which obviously will require more like IoT devices, more technology in the field, but also just, adding in machine learning and artificial intelligence to this stuff. And this is where the scope broadens from just capturing the emissions data or the fugitive emissions data from your operators. It can go into other things, your flow rates, your pressures, different stuff with pipelines, making sure the pigging is all going through. If all that data is going through, something like an AI algorithm can go in and identify a pattern that maybe a human operator wouldn't, especially when looking at the aggregate. There's a flow rate that's changed slightly here, or the pressure drops slightly, like almost imperceptibly for a human, but enough to notify them that maybe this spot, you should go check this seal for fugitive emissions, right? And then that just kind of rolls up to where you're more active and you're proactive in getting rid of this stuff, so we can get to that zero tolerance if at all possible. And then on top of that, getting rid of the human aspect as much as possible for gathering this information. I was just talking to a company last week about putting one of those hyperspectral cameras on a drone and how effective that can be, flying over a major facility and doing a full analysis in a couple hours instead of a couple days or a week, which it would take now as you're constantly repositioning the handheld camera or whatever, or flying he estimated about 100 kilometers of pipeline a day he could cover. So, and then obviously for hazardous environments, I'm also just a fan of robotics, so I kind of added this in here. But you throw these cameras or sniffers or different devices on robotics, and you throw it out there into the environment, and your operators are not at risk. There's no safety issues there, and you're still collecting the data. And this is just all an idea of where we want to take this kind of stuff. But the first step is that data management, getting it digitized, getting it off paper, and getting it consumable by everyone, including artificial intelligence eventually. So want to just quickly highlight some impacts that we've seen, companies that we work with. The main thing that everyone's obviously worried about, especially right now in the macro environment of the world, is the bottom line. So we found that generally using a system such as EasyOps or other technology solutions, your operators in the field will save time collecting and communicating this information. And obviously saves head office a huge amount of time, but we weren't tracking that in this specifically for this case study. But they did get real-time visibility into their compliance, and everything was auditable. Who did it, when they did it, where they did it, and what the numbers were as soon as that data is in the system. And actually this client is over 99% compliant, not even just for fugitive emissions reporting, but also across their platform in terms of all their compliance, pigging, all that kind of stuff. So just want to touch on that really quick. And to linger on this just for a quick second before we get to the questions, we have at EasyOps here, we have a cloud technology. It's a web-based application that works offline or online, as I mentioned. And the goal is to optimize all field operations and have an intelligent platform. And a big part of that is fugitive emissions. And obviously for the scope of this conversation today, it is fugitive emissions. But there are things beyond that, obviously, maintenance, scheduling inspections for all of your facilities, that kind of thing. So wanted to touch on that at the end. The idea is to make AI make the decisions for your operators for you, but where they're supposed to go, what they're supposed to inspect, and what they're supposed to maintain. That's kind of the idea here. So now we can jump into the Q&A. I see we got some questions there.
Thanks, Jordan, and appreciate that. And Hillary, just a logistical question first. There are questions about will the slides of the presentation be shared? So are you folks okay with sharing your presentation?
I am, yep.
Okay, thank you. And we'll of course have a copy of the recording available for download later as well. There's another question here. Can you please describe the fitting count method for quantification of fugitives, its relative credibility and preferred methodology? Who wants to take it?
I can take that question.
Okay.
So yeah, there is a methodology for counting all of your fittings and components at a site. And I think the emission factors are from CAP actually, where it's standard emissions or standard assumed fugitive emissions and leaking rates for all of those components. So what you do is catalog and inventory all of those components, apply that emission factor, and then you have your assumed fugitive emissions quantification. I don't love that method. It definitely is a lot more conservative. But it was required kind of maybe 5-10 years ago when there weren't a lot of fugitive emissions surveys. So now that pretty much every site requires some sort of survey or even a screening, I do prefer using the actual survey data, leak repair data, and quantifying it that way. But yes, depending on what your methodology is, you could use the component count as well.
Okay, well, thank you, Hillary. This next one's for Jordan. The question is, do you work with AMEP or the Alt-FEMP programs?
We don't currently. Typically, no, I think the easiest way to answer that is no, we don't work with them closely right now. We generally are just a data aggregator, and then we supply our customers or our clients with the data they need, and they can work with whatever framework they want or communicate that however they want.
Right.
Typically, we're just a service provider at that stage.
Okay. Thank you. Are natural gas power plants part of regulated facilities to conduct surveys in Alberta? It's probably for Hillary.
Yeah, I can grab that. Yeah, if they are a standalone power plant, they are not regulated. Like, they're not part of the upstream oil and gas industry, so they are not required to do these surveys. I guess unless it is part of European approval, but I don't think that is normally a requirement. But if you have an integrated or co-located power plant that is integrated with your oil and gas facility, then yes, it would be kind of part of that scope. So it's kind of a similar thought process of using the most stringent methodology for a group of different sites that are considered one physical site. So you would be required to include that as well.
Thanks for that. I wanted to ask some more basic foundational questions that might help everyone with their plans going forward. And of course, we've seen the new methane emissions regulations come in the last number of years, but not in 2012. So how do we really actually determine a baseline from which to evaluate people's emissions reductions?
That's a great point, because I think what we've seen in the past couple of years is, as we are required to do more fugitive surveys, your fugitive surveys or fugitive emissions have actually increased, although they likely did not. But just because you are have more eyes on them, it seems like an increase. Yeah, and so like that is, I don't think there is a right or wrong answer here. I think it's something that you have to justify within your board or in your ESG report of why these emissions have actually increased. Not that they have increased, but just because more attention and more new technology and methodology has been used to quantify them. So yeah, finding a baseline is difficult, but yeah, again, I don't think there is a right or wrong answer here. I think it's more about educating and kind of putting that as extra facts and stipulations for the actual increase.
So there's really not any way to say one way or the other if you're compliant with a 45% if the baseline is fluid. Is that fair?
Well, if we're talking about like the 2012 baseline for the federal regs, I think how they quantified the 2012 baseline is that they did a lot of modeling. So it was a combination of actual data and some modeling, likely with some like emission factors or component counts, like different academic exercises like that. So that baseline in terms of the federal reduction targets should not change. If we keep changing it, then it'll be impossible to meet our reduction targets. So that will always maintain, from my knowledge, it should always be at the 2012 levels. But how it was developed, I think it has to be a combination of field data and assumptions.
And this methodology has been accepted by the provinces, because we do have equivalency agreements in place with respect to the 45%. So it would suggest that they've accepted that baseline, or they've determined their own.
Yeah, I have heard that the AER specifically in the initial stages of equivalency did have a lot of issues with how the federal government quantified the 2012 emissions. I don't know what the outcome of that was, but they have come to some sort of agreement, which is why we do have equivalency. But that is definitely part of the talks that the provinces are having, like the negotiations are having. How do we quantify? Like, especially looking at Saskatchewan, where I would say there is like very little data for fugitive emissions and methane emissions in the past. So some sort of assumptions and modeling has to be made. And I think I believe that for all provinces that have equivalency, there is a document released by Environment Canada where they modeled to prove that the programs are equivalent in like how many reductions are projected. So I think you can go in and read more specifically how they determined that. I can also include those links too when we're sending out the the
Well,
slides.
yeah, that'd be great if we could get those links for people to if they have any lingering questions about the baseline. This one sort of is a little bit of a shift away from the conventional oil and gas. Are oil sands mines and tailings part of the fugitive regulations?
From my understanding, there is another regulation that has like a different regulation for fugitive requirements in that. So they do have fugitive requirements, but not under what I discussed today.
Okay, all right. Do you know where people might be able to find that answer? Would they go to their provincial regulator? Well, I guess in the case it's Alberta anyway, so would they go to AER?
Yeah, I believe it would be the AER.
Okay.
And like kind of to expand on that, like there are different requirements for refineries, for example.
Mhm.
So part of their I guess like a P approvals, like they do require a fugitive survey, but they're also subject to the federal requirements for methane reduction too. So it's kind of like a double whammy there. For refineries, the AER like specifically is not regulating it under like a formal program, but it is like a facility by facility basis. They are required to have one. So I think it will be in line with the feds. So there are some differences like that with some kind of double regulation.
Okay, well, thanks. This one is from Brandon Beck, and he's talking about the future a little bit, hydrogen facilities coming up. Is there any discussion about emissions from those facilities?
I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I would think so because it should be still regulated under the AER. So I think it's depending on how we define the facility subtype. But yeah, with more and more hydrogen facilities, I don't think that they would be able to escape fugitive surveys. It's just whether or not who regulates them, the AER or the feds. But yeah, definitely, I think there would be some sort of component that you need to meet.
Okay, thanks for that. This one is for Jordan, and it always goes to, running the business. So we're talking about increasing the leak surveys 4 times, really. If we're talking about 3 times a year versus 12 times a year, that's 4 times the increase in leak surveys. Where are we going to get the people? How are we going to actually get the people to do this? And do you see that these types of tools that EasyOps have can make a significant reduction in the number of people required, or is it just more of a small efficiency improvements? Like, are we talking about a 25% improvement in the amount of people involved in these activities? What's your thoughts?
No, it's a good question. And the idea here, especially with a platform like EasyOps, is actually to allow the same amount of operators to do more,
right?
Or even less operators, really, especially with as we advance into the machine learning side of things, like we're doing with some of our existing clients. We know we have to do inspections and maintenance a certain frequency. And in this case, like you said, going from every 3 months to every month. And part of that will just be making sure that they're doing it the most efficiently, right? You have a collection of well sites that are on the same path or something like that. You'd be amazed at how much drive time you can reduce in a year from just having the operator being told which sites to visit in what sequence on what days. And where typically you'd think, okay, I need to have 2 or 3 extra guys or people out there to do this. We've actually seen, up to 80% reduced road time just from allowing a machine learning to say, no, actually go through these sites this day, and then just plans every day for them. They just follow that sequence. So that is the power of getting it digitized and then getting it pushed into an algorithm, for sure.
Yeah, it still means you have to go out to the site in person. I mean, we've talked in many different forums about continuous monitoring, but we always come up with the concern that it's very expensive. Any thoughts about how we're going to overcome that expense and more continuous monitoring as opposed to point monitoring?
Yeah, the expense is definitely a concern. I mean, from just being alive the last 30 some odd years, not to date myself too much here, the ubiquity of technology tends to lead to its price reduction. So as this stuff becomes more readily available, these cameras become more available, commercial sized drones that could do this kind of work, and, reasonably cheap robotics to replace some of the need for people to go out there. That will probably take a little while, but will eventually start driving down some of those costs. But yeah, right now, getting IoT or SCADA devices set up, having the internet access to actually have them all piping the information, like the drone program itself, like I said, the camera's $300,000, the drones like $150,000. Like right now, the technology hasn't quite caught up to it in terms of the hardware to meet the demand that the government's asking. And I think that's where Hillary mentioned the proposed regulations might have to have some little reworks to actually make it feasible.
Right.
But certainly over time, I see the ubiquity of it. Like as everyone has to adopt this stuff, the price will just get driven down.
Right. Well, thanks. Another question from one of the attendees. Are there specific methods established or accepted for how the emissions are quantified once a leak is detected? I think, Hillary, you had mentioned that we've got different jurisdictions with different approaches to quantification. Maybe you can take that one.
Yeah. So this is one of the tricky parts. Like if we're looking at methane reduction requirements, Alberta has one way to quantify it and Saskatchewan has another way to quantify it. So if we're looking at compliance with those programs, you need to meet that. So that's all specified in all the regulations there. But outside of that, for just general greenhouse gas reporting for like Environment Canada greenhouse gas reporting, or even your internal program, your internal reporting for ESG purposes, there is no one standard methodology out there. So it is kind of up to you on what you want to justify within those reports. Like even in TIER, the Fugitives chapter has not been released yet. So right now, everyone is quantifying fugitives their own way, and AEP, like as long as it's kind of justifiable, the AEP will have to accept it because they haven't stipulated any specific methodologies that you need to meet. So it is up to what you can justify to the best of your ability. For me, I like to try to align as much as I can to each province. So if I'm reporting in Alberta, I will meet the Directive 60 requirements, even if I'm reporting to a non-AER report, and same with Saskatchewan. But I understand for, if you're doing corporate reporting for ESG, you probably want to align one way or another. So, I mean, again, that's where it gets a little tricky. But I guess to actually answer your question is outside of the specific requirements in that are stated in Alberta's methane reduction requirements, Saskatchewan methane reduction requirements, and BC greenhouse gas reporting requirements, there are many methods that you could use.
Thanks, Hillary. One of the attendees mentioned that for oil sands mines, there's a quantification of area fugitive emissions, version 2 on the Environment and Protected Areas website. So you can go there if you're looking for information on oil sands mines. Sean Williams from Birchcliff is suggesting or talking about what about an area-based survey consortium among producers for larger alt-FEMP schemes? I'm assuming, Sean, that's related to keeping the cost down and ensuring more standardization. So I don't know who wants to sort of comment on a broader consortium of producers to work together on these types of activities.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great idea. Like even when the program was first initiating, like with maximum 3 times a year, I was encouraging that as well. But I mean, I know it's one thing to say it and another thing to actually implement it. But yeah, I mean, if we are going to closer to monthly, that is a great idea, right? You will save a lot of costs, and you just kind of focus on different regions, especially for places that are more remote. If you're going to fly someone in, you might as well fly one person in and just do the whole region. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. And on that note, I'm seeing that it's 10:59 and we've come to the end of the webinar. I want to thank all of our participants for joining us. And I want to especially thank Hillary and Jordan for an excellent presentation. These are issues that will only continue to get more complicated and complex. And here at PTAC, we're always trying to help the sector understand and provide them with more and better tools. So thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.